welcome to another episode of Spectrum Uncensored. Today I have with me Jim from Melbourne. Thank you for your time today.
Hello.
It's nice to have you here. Would you like to tell me a little bit about your diagnosis?
Yes, so I have received diagnosis of autism level 2 and ADHD combined presentation. And that was quite interesting because I work in a special needs setting, and I went down the route of looking into getting a diagnosis because of working in that setting, actually.
Yeah, so you just saw
Um,
a lot of yourself kind of in the kids and stuff that you work with, or
I did, although I can actually trace it back to a particular well, I wouldn't say incident, but a particular situation, which was where I'd been there for about a term. This was about 7 years ago, and they were having an incursion, I think with First Nations performers in like a gym space, and it was really fantastic. But then I got to a point where I felt if I don't leave, I'm going to be really overwhelmed because it was quite loud. And the second I finished that thought, the student from my class ran out and had their hands over their ears. And then I went, oh, okay, that's interesting. And when I looked around the room, like the other teachers and stuff were not having a similar reaction to me. And I thought, okay, I'll keep tabs on that. And then over time, other things sort of like that happened. And then we got to COVID, and, a lot of disruption and whatever. And then I thought, you know what, I just need to find out once and for all. So I thankfully was able to get in and have an assessment done, and then it came back with those two, and I went, that makes more sense now.
yeah, and it's funny because a lot of the time people are late diagnosed because they've had children, and then their children are diagnosed, and then they go, oh, okay, well, you get all that stuff from me. So, and it kind of is that snowball effect. So it's good that you were so self-aware, though, like you actually in tune with your body in that regard, and trying to work out why you were having those reactions. But of course, yeah, working in a setting like that, I've noticed my son goes to a special school, and I've noticed that a lot of the people that work with him are definitely on the spectrum. You can just tell. It's not in a bad way, but just like I don't know, you just vibe with those people, and you can just tell that they get the children too. And I think that that's really helpful because it's that lived experience that comes into play within that profession. And I think that is invaluable. Like it's something that you can't teach people. So it's definitely a very important profession. And yeah, being able to have that extra kind of knowledge behind you from lived experience, I feel is very important, and is kind of worth its weight in gold. So, if you're comfortable, tell me a little bit about your childhood. In hindsight, you look back at that and go, "Oh, yeah, okay."
Yes, there are definitely occasions when, say, I would, I think like a lot of us do, sort of take things quite literally and couldn't sort of see the bigger picture. The other one, which I get now, but when I was growing up, did not get sarcasm at all. So when someone would sort of tell a sarcastic joke, I'd be sort of like, why is that funny? Like, okay. But then also looking back as well is that, for example, which is a funny joke with Dad and myself, is that despite the fact that I don't like loud noise, I really, really like motorsport and going to motorsport events. And there are pictures of me when I'm about 3 years old having a great time, but with earmuffs on, which at that stage in the late 90s was very, very unusual. And one of the places we go to had a pedestrian bridge to go from like an outfield spectator area into the pits. And after I got my diagnosis, Dad went, now I understand why you would do everything you could to not walk over the bridge until there were no cars underneath. And I said, yes, because if they were driving underneath at high speed, it would reverberate, and it'd be like, I couldn't handle it. And so he'd say, I'd try and force you to. He thought it was funny, but now he gets why I couldn't do it. See, at the time he just thought it was a bit of a quirk. But so those sorts of things are quite funny. But then also, looking back now, which again is a bit of a thing, and going back into my special interest, is that I had a friend whose father worked at the Holden Proving Ground, and she gave me a book on all the models up until that point. And at the time, I thought it was perfectly normal. But looking back, I'm like, well, actually, I would go and like decide, okay, I'm going to write them all in order of total volume of sales, or in order of which body style came out first, or in order of what song came out at what time, or something that was in the book. And I thought that was perfectly normal and like do my own lists. Whereas now I'm sort of like, well, it is normal, but also like I can see where that leads into that aspect as well. And I think a bit like a lot of us as well as like getting really heavily invested in particular interests as opposed to where, you know, yes, neurotypicals can still have their own areas that they really, really enjoy, but they more or less tend to not get as heavily invested in things. And I think that that was definitely something, looking back now, that I definitely sort of showed too. And also a bit of like not being able to pick up on a lot of social cues or not really being comfortable in a bigger setting. So like I can remember that, well, I think for, well, everybody in general anyway, but I think for a lot of neurotypicals too, like assemblies aren't great for a number of reasons. Too people, too much noise, like just, and also I think now understand the ADHD part is, oh, I need something to do with my hands, which I didn't get then. And I think also then too, I was quite, as I looking back now, I didn't understand what it was because where I was growing up and stuff, nobody really knew what autism was. Is that I was just constantly, like, I think looking back now, I was aware, oh, stop moving, stop rocking backwards and forwards. Not that I was doing a lot of that, but just a little bit on the spot, and things like that. And then also looking back to, after I got my diagnosis, I went, oh, that's why I used to break the tops of pens off because I'd wriggle with them until they'd snap. And at a more recent example, I went to a conference and they had like pens on the table. Once I'd gone through 2 broken pens in about 2 hours, I went, right, stop touching the pens. So, yeah, it's a couple of those little things that make it quite funny.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that because I think back to school where we would like, you know, dig holes into rubbers and things like that to, you know, like it was always that fidgeting thing. And I find it quite odd that we were often told that fidgeting with our hands and stuff was actually more distracting when it was doing the opposite for us. It was making us less distracted. But obviously not understanding it at the time, and there wasn't much awareness around autism and ADHD when we were going through school. There was a little bit, but it was very like stereotyped into
Oh,
a
yes.
particular box. And it still can be in some aspects,
Yes.
but I even remember I'm still in contact with some of my teachers from primary school, and my year 6 teacher, I said to her, so did you ever have any inkling that I was autistic and ADHD? She, no, I wouldn't have. And we did have an autism unit at our school where there was a bunch of kids that were on the spectrum, but they were, I don't like to use the functioning terms, but they were lower functioning. So I guess it was much more obvious in their behaviors that they were on the spectrum, but that's where, you know, it tends to be the downfall for all the people that don't present that way. It's less obvious, so people pretty much just don't think it exists. A bit like mental health. If you can't see it, then it doesn't exist, and it's just a completely wrong way to think about it. But even what you were saying with the special interests and the hyper focusing on the cars and things like that, as you were talking about that, I was actually thinking back to, I think I was about 10, and I was absolutely obsessed with Elvis and all of his albums, and I would write out all the lyrics to all the songs and stick them above my bed. I don't know why I did it, but I had to have it in order of the albums, and like it had the title of the song, and it was like on little pieces of scrap paper. It still doesn't make sense to me now, but I did stuff like that. And looking back at that, it's like, okay, no, that's probably part of it, but just not. I think a bit of a self-soothing technique. I found a lot of it was therapeutic. Music is still therapeutic, and a lot of people find that. But I think that was my way of self-soothing during that time in my life when there was a lot of traumatic things going on. So, yeah, it's just interesting to reflect on those things. And it's funny, someone can say something and it just triggers a memory that, you know, you haven't thought about in all this time. So,
Well, actually, you've triggered 2, which is quite funny. So with the Elvis one, when I was little, I was obsessed. It's a bit embarrassing now, but I was obsessed with Cliff Richard. Used
yep.
to love listening to his music to the point that my grandmother actually made me a little pink jacket which matched one that he had at a concert in the 80s. I loved it. And then
That's
also
cool.
when you're saying about digging holes in rubbers, I remember at the time thinking, why do people do that? But then looking back now, if I grabbed hold of one, I would rub it until I rubbed off all the lead off the outside rubber and it was all smooth and white. And then go to somebody,
Yep.
there you go, it's clean. And they'd be like, what do you mean it's clean? I'm like, there's nothing on it. And it's clean, like couldn't quite understand why that wasn't an advantage now. So yeah, it's funny how we can
Yeah.
bring up those memories of people.
Yeah. And the same with sarcasm. I was always told I was super sensitive, and it was just because I didn't understand sarcasm. Just as you were saying, I just took it literally, and someone was joking, and to me, it was like, "Why are you bullying me?" Like it didn't. Yeah, and still sometimes, like I get quite RSD quite bad, and so there are times where somebody will be sarcastic, and I know they're being sarcastic. Like, it's kind of like the head and the heart. You're like, okay, no, they're being sarcastic, but then on the flip side, you're like, are they though, or are they actually being mean to me? And I need to, I'm being rejected. It's just that push and pull effect with a lot of those things, and it's the same with having autism and ADHD. That push and pull effect of wanting like spontaneity and impulsivity, but then wanting routine. And I think that it's such a hard thing to describe to people when they're not able to experience it themselves. So I struggle quite a lot with that, and I would say I'm more ADHD heavy most of the time. Because I can still be quite social, but I'm also a female, so it's a totally different different set of I guess symptoms. But there's some days where my autism does shine through a lot more. So it just depends on what's happening and what you're going through as to what presents, I suppose. Do you find that for
Absolutely.
yourself too?
And actually talking about too how ADHD and autism have got two different pools. I remember one time I was driving through somewhere where I had like I was going to get lunch, and my AHD said, let's go and get lunch there. And then autism said, no, we've got our set spot, we're going there, that's all we're doing. And then AHD said, but that used to be our safe place that we went to. And then autism went, yeah, well, it burnt down, they've built it, and I'm not going there again, I'm going to the safe spot. And meanwhile, the rest of me is like, can you please come to a decision, because I'm driving and I'm getting somewhere, so please come up to a decision. Having said that, which is quite funny, is that while I know some people can be, by and large, I don't do well with indecision. So, for example, if you go to usual cafe and you're queuing up, you can tell that person goes there all the time. They get to the front of the queue and then they go to order and they're like, it's like, what do you mean, have you not already just gone bang, 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 bang? Like, just decide already. You're a mistake. And so, yeah, like anyway, it's a bit funny.
I find that too.
But then, of course, I
Yeah.
think like you might understand too, if you go, your friend says, let's go somewhere. Like, okay, so you go somewhere, and then you're looking like, I haven't got my safe food on the menu. What am I going to do? Then I have indecision, because then I'm trying to weigh up so many other variables, and meanwhile they're like, have you decided? I'm like, I haven't come up with one yet.
The pressure.
Yes, lots of pressure, and that makes it worse. And then you order something, and then you realise that was not what I thought that was. So yeah, it's kind of it's a bit funny that way. But I'm quite happy now knowing that I've got both, because I think originally when I first looked into it, I thought, autism. And then when I got ADHD back, and I went, because I still unfortunately have the stereotypes in my head. And even now people will sort of go, are you sure? And then I sort of think, if I'd been away for a week from work and I came back, because I've been unwell, and I came back and then I said, I've got diabetes, they wouldn't go, are you sure you don't dislike cake? They wouldn't say that. And that was part of the other thing too, is like, self-diagnosis is 100% valid, but I know that in my mind, a bit like when you touched on RSD before, is that I need to have it written down by a professional. Otherwise, I knew that when I got to having a bad moment, I'd just go, oh, well, you've made that up. Even though I still have that, is that part of me goes, but you've got it written in your room, in the cupboard, so if you really are doubting it, just go and read it again. So, yeah, because RSD definitely plays a part in so many things, and it definitely, as you know, makes it a lot harder with stuff, because your brain can just jump to all these conclusions when if that wasn't there, you wouldn't even get to step 1 of that process, but you're already at step 10 because your brain's made all these links that may or may not be there. And then you've got to deal with the consequence of that. It's a bit sort of like, say, where, the nature of the work is that there's always change, as there is with anything. And if, say, there's a plan for the day and then there's an unexpected change, I can go, okay, I'll just try and battle through that. But then if there's a very quick change in succession, then obviously I can't just have a meltdown at work. But internally, oh yes, full volcano and everything else going on. Can't really speak to anybody, just focusing on that. So, and then that's it for the whole, as you realize, the whole day. Then I'm just internally just a mess. And because of, again, I think the same with most positions, but like the nature of our job is, it's not a place where you can go, I need a lot of time to go and try and fix that, because you've got other priorities. Because obviously in a school, your priority is the students, so you've got to always prioritize that, even if a lot of your being's like, but I need to also like try and sit, or to try and like go and, reset or whatever. And, that isn't necessarily the case. And I think, in time, like you were saying before, one of the benefits of being, or having autism and ADHD is that oftentimes you can sort of see if, say, this student will benefit more in the situation if they had X, Y, and Z, or conversely, yes, that's been doing really well until this point, so let's move on to the next thing, because if we do a bit more saturation, it won't end as well for them as it should be. And it's really, now it's quite good being able to see that, whereas, not because they're not trying, but sometimes other, like say, not neurotypical staff won't quite see that. And when they go, how can you tell? Sometimes it's a bit hard to explain how you can sort of see it. There's just, it's
Sixth
sort of
sense.
there. And I hope that in time that, in our setting anyway, that, while obviously, as I keep saying, that the students are the number one priority, that sometimes the neurotypical staff can appreciate that the neurodivergent staff need a moment just to reset too. So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hats off to you guys, because that I always describe special schools and the like as a very controlled chaos kind of environment. Like everything is controlled, but it's very chaotic. And I feel like we neurodivergent people are predominantly problem solvers because we've spent our entire lives having to problem solve for ourselves. So we always seem to end up in a profession that is to do with problem solving for other people that are neurodivergent. So it's like we're just trying to help each other out, whether we're helping out adults or helping out children. It seems to be the same kind of trend, I suppose, in that regard. And it's hard because they always say with parents and children you need to co-regulate. So it's the same in your situation. You're trying to help these students who are also neurodivergent, and you are having trouble regulating. The students may then not be able to regulate. So there's still that kind of co-regulation situation. And if you can't step out of that situation, it might be hard to regulate again. So just because you're an adult now doesn't make it easier. And that's the thing, is people often, they focus on children, how they're going to help the children and things like that. But it's almost like we turn 18 and it's like, oh, you're an adult now, it's not an issue anymore. But that's where, extra mental health things come into play, because we are literally just like left to our own devices and with no extra support. And yeah, it can take its toll. It's quite being an adult is quite daunting. Like everyone as kids wants to grow up and be an adult, and then you become an adult and you're like, what have I done?
yeah,
this is awful.
Yeah, that's true. It's quite funny too. Like I think in the years when I kept realizing that, the more mainstream sort of labels of depression and anxiety weren't really working, is I remember one time before I got the diagnosis that this other colleagues got me to do this sort of test, and she came back and said those things. And I said, yes, I do realize that, but it's a bit like if you go into a kitchen and someone goes, "Oh, here's a towel to wipe up the wet floor," and then you go, "Yes, but the sink is still overflowing because you haven't turned the tap off yet." That's what the issue is. The issue is not the floors, but the issue is that you haven't turned the tap off yet because you haven't realised that that's what is causing the issue.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I'm still coming to terms with it because um, as someone that was assigned male at birth, I was probably diagnosed later than most assigned male at birth people, but I was diagnosed when I was 27. And when I got the results back, sat down, turned the TV on, and that was when the conflict in Ukraine started. And I went, "Oh, great! So now the anniversary is forever tied in together." So whenever they have the year update or the 2-year update, I'm like, "Yep, I haven't forgotten it's been 2 years because it's on the same day." Yes, and I've got it's really weak too because a couple other key points in my life have also got significant international conflict date at the same time. So it's like my
Yep.
birth date's the anniversary of D-Day and a few other things as well. It's just weird. But anyway, so yeah,
We find those patterns.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, finding patterns. Yes, exactly. So, yeah, and it's quite a interesting setup world and everything that we live in. But yeah, and I think one thing that I have joked sometimes, and it's amazing how it's virtually all the time. While in the moment I find a bit tricky, is that I have found in retrospect that every day where I kind of awake and I realize, right, basically every sound now is triggering me. When I get to work and I'm with the lovely group of students that I'm with, that's when they'll all be needing to stim really loudly, like all day long. And so I'm like, yes, totally get that you guys need to do it, but like, can I just turn my ears off for a good 5 hours or something? Because this is like, oh, we're all this together. Okay, fantastic. Um, but yeah.
I always joke about that. Like people go, "Would you rather be blind or deaf?" And I'm like, "Definitely deaf." Like, just turn those suckers off. Like that's
Yeah.
yeah. It's yeah. My son stims a lot. He's nonverbal, but he still makes a lot of sounds, and it's usually when he's happy. So it's it's a positive thing. But it takes its toll on you. And I'm very sensitive to sounds like crunching. Any noises to do with mouths. I don't know what it is. Like
Mm-hmm.
that wet sound. I don't know. I can't deal with it. And my son's latest obsession is watching YouTube videos of that.
All those
All those
videos.
sounds that people make. Is it ASMR or
I think
AMSR?
so, yes. Yes, I've had a few that do that
Yeah.
too, and I'm
Oh,
sort of
he
like,
finds
glad
the
you love it, but I
worst.
need to keep busy now because that's doing horrible things to me. Yes.
it's awful. Like I can feel myself like the pressure in my body rising till it gets to like my eyes, and I'm like, you need to turn that down right now or wear headphones because I literally cannot deal with this. And it's usually when I'm driving too, so it's just he'll be on his iPad and he antagonizes at the moment. He's getting close to that puberty teenage years, and
Oh.
he'll turn it up on purpose and he'll look at me and he'll be like, "You like this?" And I'm like, "No, I don't like that." So he's a cheeky kid. Oh my goodness. I guess I created that, so it's my own fault. But
Yes.
as you were saying, like I love that analogy of the tap, running and trying to mop up the floor while it's still running, because it's the same with like you've got autism and ADHD, and I always feel like I don't think it's angel and devil is not the right term, but two different people sitting on your shoulders telling you different things, and then they start fighting, and then that's when anxiety flies in and lands on your head.
Mm-hmm.
It just turns into this like massive yeah, I don't know, tornado of, and that's why people often say that they feel like there's bees in their brain or it's constantly whirring. And that's what it is. It just, there's so much internal battle between all the different things. I meet so many kids that absolutely despise loud noises, but they're the loudest noise in the room. So
Oh, yes.
it's hard to understand that.
Well, I think
And
the only thing I'll say on
yeah,
that, sorry to interrupt, because again, I need to stop doing that, is that
no,
I
it's all
find
right.
that often that when it comes, I'm not sure about you, how you feel this, but I find that oftentimes it's if the person in question, whether it's myself or a student or whoever else it might be, if they're in control of the noise they're making, it'll be as loud as it wants to be. If it's that they're around another noise, that's when it becomes an issue. So even if the other noise might not necessarily be particularly loud, it can still be enough. Whereas
Yep.
If they're making the noise or they're in control of the volume or they've at least chosen it, that completely changes the dynamic, as opposed to whether it's just their own, and I think one of the other things that, again, everyone likes to have their preferred terms, but I've found that without intention, that when people sort of like say, talk about autism and symptoms and stuff, I've decided, well, it's not a disease or an illness, so I tend to try and use like the word exhibitor, just because that's what the outward sign people will sort of see, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's a bit like, with stims. The only time that I'm going to try and redirect a stim is if it's hurting the individual or potentially somebody else, like say head
Yep.
banging, for example. Obviously, you want to move them away from that, but you don't want to tell them to stop stimming, but just find one that's a bit safer. And so I think that's, definitely one of the things is that obviously while you want people to, I guess, be aware of different things to be aware of, is then also like the language is really, really quite important. So I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of students, a bit like your son, who are non-speaking. And one thing that has been quite sad, and I've just sort of, with really good stuff, they are aware, but with, say, perhaps like stuff they're quite new to a setting, I have to remind them, hey, just be aware that perhaps because they're not speaking like you and I are, by and large, ones I've had at least have got fantastic receptive language and they absolutely know what you're saying. So be very, very mindful of that. Many years ago, I had a student, and again, non-speaking, but had very good receptive language, but also I'm fairly sure he could lip read as well. And before I was working with him, I think the teacher had at the time was saying that he was, at that stage, he was obsessed with something, he was trying to get to something, and where she'd hidden it to his parent. So the next day, when the teacher was busy, he went and found that because he'd lip read what she said, even though he was in the car and the door was closed. So I think they tend to forget that, and there is still, I think it is getting a lot better, but there is still that sort of aspect of infantilizing non-speaking students a little bit. So whereas, surprise, surprise, if you talk to a 14-year-old non-speaking student like they're 14 years old, as opposed to being 2 or 3, they love it, because it's like, well, of course I'm 14 years old. Just because I'm not speaking to you in a conventional way doesn't mean that I'm still not the same person that I am. Just like, as we've all had, if we have a boss or something that infantilizes us, we're like, hello, like, is there a bit of miscommunication somewhere? Like, I know what you're saying.
There's
Or
nothing worse than a condescending tone.
exactly, yeah, because we've all had that person that's sort of like, so we're going to be doing this today, and I need you to be working over there. And brain's like, please speak fast, you're taking too slow. But also, is like, just, what are you doing? If you want to make me get really irritated, then you're doing a good job. But yeah.
Yep. Yep. I can really relate to that because my son is so much like that. The amount of times somebody comes in and speaks to him like he's a puppy dog or he's a
Yes.
baby, you just see the look on his face. He does this, like, he screws his face up, like,
Mm.
and he does not hide it, that he's unimpressed. And he's got a very expressive face, but he's just like, ew, just no, get away from me. And he is very good with first impressions. I've noticed that he's very switched on when it comes to the vibe he gets from people. At the minute he meets them and they open their mouth, you can tell he'll either grab their hand and be like, I like you, or no, don't come near me, and he'll get as far away as possible. So he's very like switched on. I feel like it's a sixth sense with that kind of stuff. And people will forget too that not being able to talk is one less kind of thing to get in the way of your like observation skills. So he's so observant because he listens, and he looks because he can't talk. So it kind of, the observation skills take over, and he's very switched on. He's very smart. He's got incredible problem solving skills. He's even got a photographic memory, which gets him into a lot of trouble sometimes. But you're right, like, it's, people underestimate it. Like, if somebody was in a wheelchair and can't walk, you're not going to just automatically assume they're dumb because they can't walk. Like, so why do people do that when somebody can't communicate verbally. Like my son can still communicate, he just doesn't use words. So if anything, it takes a lot more effort for him to have learned how to communicate in these different ways, and it takes more time. It takes it can be frustrating because all you need to do is press the wrong button on. He's got a talker, like an AAC.
Yes.
So we call it a talker because it's easier, but like he presses one wrong button and it goes elsewhere. He's got to start again. So that would be frustrating. And whereas, if we say one wrong word, we can correct it quite quickly. So
yes.
it's, people do definitely underestimate just because he doesn't speak. So I always find that quite baffling because, if somebody's deaf, you don't assume that they can't understand. If somebody's blind, you don't assume they can't understand. So why is it that because he doesn't speak, you assume he doesn't understand? I just don't understand it. I guess because human nature is, a lot of it is like we connect through communication. So if it's an alien way of communicating, the connection is not necessarily there, or easily there. It takes effort to connect with that person because they communicate differently, and I guess that is why. I guess.
I think so. I think it's also a bit like too, like if say people are speaking to a relative from overseas and you've got that bit of a delay, is that because sometimes, time poor and everything else, I guess, is that people sort of think, oh, well, they haven't responded straight away. Whereas sometimes I sort of say, hang on, or at least think, hang on, just wait a few seconds. I'm taking a little while to sort of get in there, and then they've got to form a response, and they've got to express whatever the response is, whether they're speaking or non-speaking. And it's only then that if you realise, okay, well, now 10 seconds has passed, and by and large, with the students I work with, if they have my response, then obviously I do need to repeat whatever it is they've said, but then also look at it as, okay, instead of saying 10, instead of saying 6 words, if I've said maybe 15, probably should try and rephrase it to be a bit shorter, because obviously it's a bit too long. But it's all just sort of, I guess, revisiting how you say something, giving them time to respond and trying to make it not confuse. Like, I try and do better, but there are some days where I'll say something and then I'll go, what fruit salad of a sentence was that? Like, no wonder they're a bit confused. Like, and it's quite funny because I'm finding at the moment that ADHD is like, hi, all the time at work. And so sometimes I'll go and say something and about 4 sentences try and like crash into each other and come in my mouth at the same time. And so I have to sort of, I make a bit of a joke, go, blah, 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 blah. Okay, start again. And then I'll do it again. And I have noticed too that then if a student is finding it hard to get something out, that they're not feeling a stress because, oh, well, Jim does it and he's fine. So, they're fine. So,
Yep.
it's quite funny in that way that, sort of, again, I think a big part of it is that there definitely are challenges and stuff, but if you can look at it in a positive light or try and find things that are, amusing or whatever, and also obviously celebrate wins that to other people might not seem as a particularly major thing, but in the life of the person working with is a really significant thing, is really, really key, especially to when you can help the student to learn various self-coping mechanisms, because sometimes it can be easy to sort of fall into one category or the other. But sometimes I sort of find, well, because I'm at the moment working with older students at school who are nearing the end of their schooling journey, is trying to help them to find various means so that, with me thinking, when they're out in the community, if coping mechanism 1 is unavailable or fails, then they've got 2 and 3, hopefully. So then, if they're out in the shops and it's too busy, too loud, or there's been a few things that haven't gone their way, that they can revert to those and still be safe and be able to regulate and all of that. Whereas sometimes, because, schools are under-resourced in terms of staffing and programs and things like that, that sometimes it's almost a little bit easier to just try and sort of focus on one. But that's why it always worries me that, no, try and have a backup, like if you've got to go to an appointment and then something happens to the car, if you go, oh, well, can't go anywhere forever now, that isn't really a solution. Got to come up with something else. So I think definitely working on that is, one of the things that hopefully we can all all do. And when you can see that happening, and then also when the student initiates that self-regulation without having to say anything, and you can watch
Yep.
as you dial back what you have to do, but watching that part is just so wonderful.
Yeah, well, there was actually a quote that I read the other day about communication, and it was the biggest communication problem is that we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply. And I think that's part of the problem too, because um, if we can't understand the other person's communication style, then we can't respond. So you need to be able to understand before you can reply. So I do feel like that is part of it, and it's that connection. And you're right, like it's always trying to work out. We're constantly trying to fix problems. Like it feels like every day is just full of problems because this world is just not built for us, and so we're trying our best to make it built for us. And it's so important. Like I find my son's been in a mainstream school, no good. He went to a special school, fantastic. He feels embraced. He feels accepted for who he is. People are actually trying to like go out of their way to help him in a way that he needs help, instead of the way that they think he needs help. It's people aren't necessarily being malicious when they're trying to help us or the kids. It's just that lack of education. But in this day and age, there's no real excuse for it. There's so much out there to be able to educate yourself. And
Absolutely.
yeah, we're not asking for them to change the world. Like we're not asking for anything that I feel is unreasonable. It's just, them, and them, I mean neurotypical people doing what we're doing for us, what we've done for them for billions of years, which is make them feel comfortable. So why is it a one-way street in that regard? That's I suppose what I'm trying to get to is that we are constantly trying to stop ourselves from stimming on a train because the neurotypical person sitting next to us is going to feel uncomfortable if we're doing it. But why is it us that is constantly having to sacrifice our own comfort for the comfort of other people? So it's I find that it's quite frustrating that you almost feel like you're treated like less than human because you're wired differently. But you look at all the things that have been created over thousands of years, and you can it's probably a sure bet that it was all neurodivergent people that created those things. Like we wouldn't have advancements in technology if it wasn't for neurodivergent people. So,
Exactly.
we wouldn't be using this platform right now, I don't think, if it wasn't for neurodivergent people.
Exactly. And I think touching on your train example too is the problem that the person on the train doesn't see once you get off the train is that not only have you been needing to stim, but you've also been spending a lot of energy actively masking and trying not to. So then by the time that you get to wherever your safe place is, you've got to spend twice as long trying to then self-regulate and self-soothe. And if you're a parent or if you're a carer or if you've just got something else that you're getting off the train to go and do, then you're not operating from a basis of, well, I'm settled, I'm calm, I can tackle this. Is you're expended, but you've still got to somehow get through that situation. And and then obviously you're weighing up too that just because I'm now spent doesn't mean that then I can go and put that load into somebody else either. So there's a lot of things that I think people sort of forget about that aspect, or perhaps just don't realize. Again, I don't think that most of the time it's religion. I think most of the time it's just not that lack of awareness, which is something that we can all work to improve on. But I think it definitely is something that still needs to get better with time and that sort of thing. And one thing that I do find, it's the nature of every job, but one thing I do find quite of a challenge is that because essentially, while most teachers that I work with sort of view the teacher assistant as being very much on the same playing field, there's none of this hierarchical thing in the classroom, other than obviously that they do all the planning and the assessment and all of that and whatever, of course, and they've got all the qualifications and experience. But in terms of how they interact with us and the students interact with us, it's all on the same plane, is that historically speaking, and even up until now, so many times I've thought, it'd be so helpful to have like a psychology degree or to have, all these other things, which would make the job that I'm doing a lot more beneficial because I'd have that evidence-based knowledge behind me, but then the usual follow-through with that is that then you go and work in that field and then you're not in this one anymore. And insofar as this field is, unless I move into more of an admin-based role as opposed to being in the classroom one, that's the only way to sort of go any further qualifications-wise, really. Other than like, the occasional one off PD here and there that I did last week. But that gets quite annoying because every time you think, oh, that bit of information would be really helpful to have, but you don't have it. And that's one thing that I think would be really, really good to get down to the level of classroom support staff, and then like carers and rest workers and stuff like that. Is a lot of that information needs to get down to that point because they're with our young people all the time, well, not young people as well, all the time, and so they're the ones that need to have all that knowledge. And while researchers need to do their thing, it needs to get down all the way because otherwise it's not going to actually benefit the people that need it. So
no, I agree. It's upskilling. So upskilling is important, and it's like being on a ship. You've got the teacher who is steering the ship, but all of the aides are doing everything else. They're adjusting the mast and they're pulling in the ropes and all that kind of thing. And you're not going to go anywhere if no one can pull up the anchor. So it's definitely a group effort. And I feel like being a teacher aide would be one of the most challenging jobs, but also one of the most rewarding jobs. And it's a very important job because the kids, they look to you for safety and comfort. And I know with my son, he's got a particular aide in his class that he's had for 2 years, and this is his second year with her, and he adores her. She's his safe person. If she's not there, he's not regulated. He's looking for her. So, it's all about building rapport. And often we're told, oh, you need to get used to the fact that people change and that things, people disappear and this and that. And it's true because it does happen in life. But during that period of time, when you're trying to build that resilience, if you can give them that level of comfort so that they have the opportunity to build that resilience, that's what they need. And it is a very important profession that needs to be upskilled accordingly. So I definitely agree with that. You need those tools so that you can help the children and the adults better.
And actually, too, that's one of the things as well is that, there are many schools that, for various reasons have it where there's the support staff do move around a lot to cater for the various needs of different students and stuff. And I've often thought, for example, that I couldn't be like a relieving teacher assistant from one school to the other because I couldn't deal with all the change. And so I've been quite fortunate, at least in where I've been, that by and large, the students that I've supported do need to have very consistent staff. So that then also means that as a benefit of that, I know where I am every day and I don't have to sort of stress where I'm going to be today. And so while it's very, very helpful for them, it's also very helpful for me because every day I'm the same. I'm in
and
the
that's
same
not hurting
spot.
anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah. So I think it's quite quite helpful for both them and for me that everything is everything is consistent, and the other thing too, which I think is also important that we are definitely moving towards as well, and I think you've touched on it in previous podcasts as well, is helping students understand that being angry isn't bad, being sad isn't a problem, but just more healthier ways of expressing it, I guess. So, for example, it's perfectly fine to be angry or upset or confused or worried or whatever, but this is how we handle that in a more appropriate way that, is healthier for us and for other students and stuff like that. And so we are definitely getting better at that, but there's something that I think would be good to do, because I know when I was growing up and stuff that was always sort of like, don't be angry, don't be angry, don't be angry, as opposed to, it's fine to feel that. That's a perfectly fine emotion, but you need to, this is how it's appropriate to have that emotion so that we can sit in it for a bit, learn what to do with it when we're feeling it, and then move forward productively. And that's quite, I think, still key for me, because when I was going through the diagnosis part, is one of the things that the person picked up that I had difficulty with was alexithymia, because I don't, other than like the obvious ones of like angry or sad, what I have found quite funny is when they have a task at school of students, name this emotion, I get past the clearly like cartoon angry face and the clearly cartoon sad face, and then I go, I've got no idea what any of those ones are. Got no idea. And I think one time I I looked at them and went, is it that one? And the teacher's like, no, no, it's this. And then I went, okay. And then like 3 or 4, and then she goes, all right, how about you go and do that, and I'll do this one, because I was just could not pick up what they were. It was really really fun, and but then also, while it is quite funny, and I have found that as an extension from that, that if I don't know someone, I'll look at them and go, oh, I think they're angry, and then I'll ask them and go, no, no, I'm fine, and I realise that unlike perhaps neurotypicals or people who don't have that, you can sort of apply different mannerisms for the same range of emotions. Whereas for me, I have to sort of try and learn what it is for each individual person. And then that's when I get that sort of mixed up. And then also at the same time is not really being able to figure out what my own is. I can just go, I feel bleh, but I don't know what that is. So it's quite good then when you're with students doing that because you're helping them, but also there's a bit of, self-growth learning is in that space too. So
yeah, you definitely would realize that there's some things that you didn't learn, but you never really thought about it. So it's just, yeah, it's interesting that I find that we're forever learning and forever growing. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if somebody suspects that they're on the spectrum but isn't diagnosed, what kind of advice would you give them?
So I would suggest, first of all, that self-diagnosis is entirely valid, especially because especially if you're an adult, it's extremely expensive and can be quite a long, protracted process. But at the same time, don't just rely on TikTok or YouTube or other social media as your diagnostic tool, because obviously it isn't. So try and do a lot of research, touch base with a lot of autistic or neurodivergent groups, meet people. There's constant memes that if you meet another autistic person, you're both viable, you probably are. Do that. But then also is if you do want to go down the route of having an official diagnosis, then it's important to find one who is, if you're an adult, is able to diagnose adults. And if, say, you're assigned female at birth, or identify as female, that you find someone who can diagnose in that, because as we know, females and people who are assigned female at birth are very much underrepresented in that space because of all the history of, it wasn't, only boys can have it and all that other nonsense. So essentially look into it properly, find someone that can do that, also that you think that you can, once you meet them, you realize, yep, I think this is going to be a productive process. And then, figure out, is this where I want to go? And then also from that as well is, will it help me? Because obviously if you get the diagnosis, it's a lot of money, but it doesn't really lead anywhere. That may or may not necessarily be a helpful thing. So in my case, I'm trying to go through doing some NDIS supports for myself. So that's something that you want to look into. That can be very helpful. But otherwise, if it's not necessarily going to be helpful more than just having that piece of paper, which is enough for some people, entirely valid, that's great. But otherwise, then just consider perhaps other forms, again, like touching base with other autistic people, or looking into sort of what it means to be autistic as well.
Yeah, I definitely feel like finding your people's an important one, because you don't feel alone then either. If you're just looking for answers, I feel, and I feel that if you've got the answers, that in itself is empowering. But it's not the be all and end all. As you say, there's supports out there, but sometimes having that diagnosis could be not damaging, but less productive than you'd like it to be. Unfortunately, we're still catching up in the world as to equal rights and stuff in those domains. So it's definitely something you have to think about carefully and do your research on. But I can say from my point of view, I'm glad I did it. It taught me a lot about myself, and it meant that I could forgive myself for a lot of the things that I do and just go, okay, well, now I know why I do those things. So that's cool. I'm cool with that. And a lot more self-accepting, I think. So there's a lot less, don't feel ashamed as much anymore. I feel like that in itself was worth it for me personally. But that's some sound advice. And and thank you for coming in and chatting and sharing with me today. It means a lot that you've put yourself out there, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you and have a chat. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for having me.
And hopefully I'll get to chat to you again in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Take care.
You too.